Ecuador as a country is one of the largest cacao exporting countries in the world. Farmer Miguel inherited the farm from his parents, and his mother still lives on the farm with him. And they have been longtime cacao farmers. And in Ecuador, as a large cacao exportation country, it's very common at this point to see heavy application of pesticides, because the model, and this is not unique to Ecuador, but the model currently across the globe is large crop yield as quickly as possible. Because in most of the world, the price for cacao beans is set by a handful of large corporations, and they say, we're going to pay you X dollar amount for your cacao, what you grow, based upon what we see as supply and demand trends. And so that's what's set, and the farms then work as quickly and diligently as they can to grow as much cacao as possible to meet that. Now, in general, with agriculture, not just cacao, when we are looking for high yield at a quick pace, which is not necessarily how nature would operate. Nature is always optimizing, so wanting to come back into balance, which means that depending on ambient conditions or whatever is happening, there will be fluctuations in production naturally, but when you're trying to quickly produce, what is very common is heavy pesticide use, typically more of a monocropping model, so only growing cacao and growing as much cacao as possible in as little space as possible. And like all plants, but especially in tropical regions, that makes the crops very susceptible to pests because there's not a lot of breathing room. There's a lot of stuff happening in tight corridors, and the cacao is under stress. Just like if we as humans were under stress, we might get more sick, right? So that's what tends to happen. So this particular farmer was operating under that environment, which is very common, and it makes sense. No blame for the farmers, of course. They're just trying to do the best to do what they know and to also make revenue and to meet the needs that are being asked of them by the exporters of the cacao. Farmer Miguel inherited this farm, and as you mentioned, just was still continuing in that practice and process, but realizing just how out of alignment it was for him, and especially for his own body. He was not feeling well, and he kind of came to this point of moral and health crisis where he was torn because he felt like his only options were to continue down that path and poison himself, literally, and his family and his community, or not. And the or not brought a lot of question marks because this was his family's legacy. It was what they knew. He felt pride in having a cacao farm and wanting to continue in their tradition. So he really was just at a loss at that point. And so, as you mentioned, he essentially just stopped. He said, I don't know what to do here, but I'm going to just have to take a moment and figure it out. And in that process, which happened relatively quickly in the grand scheme of things, the farm started to naturally self-correct as he wasn't applying any resource to it. And it has been a process of 8 years where they've gone from what was conventional, full of pesticides and toxicity, and a lot of just dis-ease in all aspects of the operation, to a farm that is now fully regenerative. And it's so incredible to watch and witness. And they are still producing high yield, potentially not as high as what the hardcore farms are doing, but his health is better, the ecosystem is thriving. I joke that when I was sitting on that farm, I got more bug bites than in the jungles of Ecuador, which is actually true. And that is a testament to how vibrant the ecosystem is. If you can be standing in a cacao field and you're getting hit with all sorts of insects, then they are also thriving. And, I think we often want to think about things being like clean and pure and like, if there's no bugs there, then we want to hang out there. And while that may be true from a comfort perspective, what is also true is when you are in a robust ecosystem where you have healthy bird populations and healthy pollinator populations, and even the tiny little insects that pollinate the cacao flowers, which are the most minute, we want there to be a robust flora and fauna, and that includes from the ground up. And so it's really an incredible story. It's so inspiring. And that's just one example. This is happening in many places. And for me to get to be there and witness and hear from them just what was possible when he chose to take a step back and to really let nature lead the process. And through that, they also discovered so much about the ecosystem. They came to learn about an aquatic plant that is native to that region in Ecuador that grows wild. It's essentially just something that's in water systems, and it's an incredible water purifier. And so they started collecting just off the side of the road buckets of this plant and dumping it into their irrigation canals. And this plant naturally absorbs any sort of chemicals or pesticides or toxicity. So they completely cleansed all of the water in their farm, which had been contaminated by both their farm's pesticide use, but also adjacent farms, just through a natural plant that exists there, right? So the ecosystem knew exactly what was needed. It was just a matter of them observing and recognizing, oh, if we stop adding toxicity and we allow what's native to this region to work in the way that it knows how, it wasn't that complex. And it did take that wisdom and insight from him and his team to recognize, like, what we've been doing isn't working and isn't going to work in the long term. So what can we do? And it was really through the practice of listening to nature and listening to the plants. And there's so many aspects to it. They also observed, just by paying attention, that their fruit started to get sweeter. The cacao fruit started to get sweeter and take on more robust flavors. And it was because there were fruit trees around the property. So they had banana and papaya and mango, and as the entire ecosystem started to get healthier, those trees were fruiting more, and the cross-pollination that was happening actually changed the flavor of their cacao, which is so beautiful, and it's so delicious. Oh my goodness, it has this incredible, you can taste like caramelized banana notes and like a fruity aftertaste that almost has acidity. It's gorgeous. And that's because their ecosystem is so healthy and thriving. So now they're excited to have intercropping, which also just helps the entire environment be healthier, because as you have more biodiversity, you attract more different bird species, and all of those different fruits are better for the pollinator communities too, because they have more diversity of the pollen that they collect, which also helps their immune system. So it's just so awesome that nature, A, is so wise, and B, just in allowing it to do its thing and giving it the space to breathe, that they're doing something really unique and different. And the last thing I'll say about that is what's been amazing in partnering with them is A, hearing their story and learning where they're at, and B, we've been able to work with them to understand from our side of things, like what is needed from the supply chain perspective, not about certain quantities or certain price points. We're very happy to work with them directly to make sure that they're receiving a proper living wage for what they're producing. That's not what I mean, but what I mean is that when we first met Farmer Miguel, they were producing cacao paste, which is what we use here to make all of our drinking cacao blends, one of which we're enjoying right now. And cacao paste is essentially fermented, dried, lightly roasted, and then ground cacao beans or seeds to make it into this smooth texture. And then we use that, we grind it up to make our drinks. There's a certain amount of smoothness required to be able to produce a really silky, delicious drink, which is what our customers know and love. So when we first met Farmer Miguel, we worked with him to get some changes to the equipment that he was using so we could receive his product in a way that made it really palatable for our customers, which he was also happy to do. So this is what happens when you're having these full circle relationships, is that there's direct communication and a feedback loop where now we can all work together to make it more viable for him to distribute his products more widely, and simultaneously we get to support a farmer that's an incredible leader for his farm and the surrounding community of what's possible in beyond sustainable to regenerative growing practices.
It's so inspiring because he was faced with this situation and he didn't know what to do. And it probably felt really limiting at the time because all he knew was what he knew. And I think that's an issue most people face, is we've grown up in this way of being, so we think this is the only way. And for him to take a chance and to let things go and just see what happens is so beautiful.
Another really sweet piece of all of this is, as he and his team have learned and observed more and been working in harmony with nature, they're building this model that one of their goals that they're working towards is to be able to socialize that to other farms. So they did the hard work in taking those 8 years to really learn those practices, and what they're now pitching to other farms is, hey, you can do this too. And here's the way to do it. So it's taking what they've learned. And obviously There is immense power in observation and listening, and the living, breathing experience, I don't think can be fully replicated.
Yeah.
And for them to share the insights that they gleaned, so people can do that more quickly without the potential pain or stress of having a farm take the time that it needs to turn over and to learn. It'll quicken that process to some extent, which will also make it more viable for more farms to follow their lead.
Yeah.
And then it'll help the entire broader ecosystem to start to heal itself and rebalance. And it's really amazing. I mean, you think about how long these practices have been in place, which is at least 30 years or more of using heavy pesticides and all of these things. And 8 years, and the farm is so healthy, vibrant, thriving, and they're not applying anything outside of what's in their ecosystem there. So one thing that they do have on their farm is neem trees, and neem is this incredible natural antifungal, and so they sometimes will gather the oil from the neem seeds and actually fumigate their fields, so you basically just like make an incense and walk with it, and any sort of dampness or moldiness, or because cacao trees are very sensitive just because they're growing in natural environments. So that neem will help to rebalance it, but it literally grows right next to the cacao tree. So even for that capacity to observe and recognize, like when there is a need for a little adjustment in the system, we can just look and here it is, this is exactly what we need.